Hello. Now, let us analyze the evolution of military organizations in antiquity. And to do so, first, let's start with the dawn of time, with the hunter-gatherers. And soon they learned two basic concepts. First, they need to use tools, and second, to work as teams. And among their tools, soon they crafted long-range weaponry to take down prey from a distance, and short-range weaponry for close combat. And they also learned the enormous usefulness of working as teams while hunting, particularly against large prey. Furthermore, even in those early days of humanity, there could be fighting against other tribes. And when that happened, all physically able adult males had to take their hunting implements and any other tool and fight. At that time, all able-bodied adult men were militiamen. Of course, they were not professional warriors. Each militiaman had his own weaponry, and in an emergency, he was called to defend the group. On any battlefield of those days, at the start of the action, all warriors/militiamen will remain at a distance from the enemy, shouting and proffering insults against their enemies in the hope that their foes will retreat from the field. But if that failed, eventually they will rush forward. And out of their mad dash forward, there were two options. First, they will crash head-on into each other and remain locked in deadly hand-to-hand fighting. Or, in the second place, after a few seconds of running, they will stop at a distance, but close enough to launch projectiles and shout more insults. And from the new location, from time to time, small groups of warriors will rush forward to fight hand-to-hand actions. This second option of combat is nowadays called a dynamic stalemate. And we can assume that this was preferred over a full melee to avoid mass casualties. Also, we need to recognize that the formation for these warriors will be an open deployment, with each warrior at a certain distance from each other, both to use their long-range weaponry and also to avoid presenting a dense target against enemy projectiles. Furthermore, we have to recognize there was no proper cooperation among those men. Thousands of years passed by until that transcendental moment in the history of humanity. At the beginning of the Neolithic period, nomad tribes learned the value of agriculture and started to settle in by 900 BC. Wheat, corn, and rice were cultivated, and from the sowing of the seeds in the field to the harvest, only a few months passed by. And once the grain had been cultivated, it could be stored for a long time. And together with agriculture, the domestication of animals dramatically increased the food stocks available and the populations grew. And thus, with more inhabitants and a territory already considered as their own, soon early control and administration systems appeared among the settled tribes. And in part, those systems produce combat organizations. And now we reach the first state in the history of humanity, the Sumerian state, which appeared in 1600 BC. And, as an interesting note, at its peak, around 3000 BC, it seems that Sumer had 1.1 million inhabitants. And that number is relevant because at that moment in time, it seems that our planet had 25 million inhabitants. So, Sumer had 4% of the planet's population, and its form of government was mainly an absolute monarchy, in which a single individual took all the decisions of the state, including how to gather and organize her armed forces. In fact, a great advantage of studying Sumer is that it helps us to understand the evolutionary process of military organizations in three fields. 1. The relationship of the individual/warrior with the state. 2. The specialization of the warrior. And 3. The search for technology and cutting-edge organizations to gain an advantage over an enemy. On the first point, in Sumer, it seems that the militiamen continued to be part of their military. In peaceful times, the militiaman will labor independently. He could be a merchant, an artist, or a farmer. But when necessary, he will be called to arms. A levy will be a mandatory call issued by the state, and a portion of the militiamen from each region will be called to arms. And I must be clear, the militiamen did not receive a pay or equipment from the state. And in the initial days of Sumer, militiamen received no training from the state. But at the same time, with the appearance of governments, a new warrior appeared. A warrior who in times of peace received payment from the state. Therefore, by definition, he was a professional who was part of the security apparatus of the state. And this new warrior protected the king and his government. Throughout history, professional warriors have been only a fraction of available forces, with militiamen and later conscripts and reservists being the bulk of the armed forces of the state. Second, we have the specialization of the warrior, and in Sumer there were already two types of infantrymen, the light and the heavy. And to understand their functions, let us take a look at a battlefield. In those days, with the armies already deployed, the first event will be the combat between heroes. Warriors of great reputation fought against their foes to cover themselves with glory. And with each successful duel, the morale of their army increased. But that was only a preamble. Then, the light infantry stepped forward. Their protective equipment was light. That way they could use their long-range weaponry. They were skirmishers, who were deployed in open order formation. And with their projectiles, they will cause casualties and degrade the enemy's will to fight. Then, it was the turn of the heavy infantrymen, and in their development, we must mention the evolution of metals. In the Near East, the Copper Age arrived in 4500 to 3000 BC, and then it was the turn of the Bronze Age, from 3000 to 1200 BC. And with better metals, it was thought to have an advantage, for the heavy infantrymen had a heavy weapon of sharp metal, and a substantial amount of protection which included pieces of metal. Definitely, he could not move easily. However, he was a specialist in close-range combat, and the heavy infantrymen joined together, and at a signal they will rush forward, uttering furious shouts and screams in hope that they will overwhelm their adversaries in a single blow. But if they did not succeed, they will be locked in a confusing melee in which the number of casualties will be substantial. And that combat will continue until one side disintegrated. Or, on the other hand, the other option was again to arrive at a dynamic stalemate. And both scenarios could happen because at the beginning of history, heavy infantry fought without any organization. For hundreds of years, that was the pattern of combat. but experience accumulated, and by 3000 to 2300 BC, Sumerians brought to their battles both cutting-edge equipment and cutting-edge training. And on the first place, innovative equipment gave them humanity's first fast combat units. Thousands of years prior to 2500 BC, large animals had already been harnessed to push carts, and out of that practice, war chariots appeared. And it is relevant to note that the Sumerian war chariots appeared long before cavalry made its debut. And it is also relevant to note that their chariots were used as platforms to launch projectiles. Thus, in a battle, after the usual action of heroes, all the men equipped with long-range weaponry and the new war chariots advanced to the front. And first, the Sumerian chariots will rush forward to run down the enemy light infantry, and then they will close as much as possible to the enemy heavy infantry to launch projectiles. But if that enemy infantry was in a dense formation, the chariots will not crash into them. No matter what Hollywood says, the animals that pulled the chariots could not be coerced to collide against a dense mass of infantrymen. However, the use of those chariots should not be underestimated. A mass of chariots approaching at high speed, launching projectiles, would have been a psychological impact on a less sophisticated enemy. And thus, together with the action of their other skirmishers, their objective was to cause casualties and reduce the adversary's will to fight. And then, the Sumerian heavy infantry will emerge forward and advance in an innovative tactical formation, the phalanx. Yes, in Sumer, phalanxes appeared 2000 years before the Greek phalanxes. And as in all other phalanxes in history, the Sumerian heavy infantry was equipped with spears and heavy protective equipment. But most important of all of those warriors were deployed in several battle lines, creating dense blocks, and the warriors in those blocks learned to remain in their positions and to move forward at the same time. The Sumerian heavy infantry had already learned the value of cooperation, order, and discipline. They worked as a huge team, supporting each other in a close order formation. And to have their phalanxes, the state had to provide its militiamen with standardized training, either by instructors or by distributing some type of manual. And so, the blocks of Sumerian infantry surged forward, overcoming the possibility of staying behind in a dynamic stalemate. And in a clash, the sturdiness of their formation gave them an enormous possibility of dissolving a less prepared enemy. And thus, after crashing against the enemy, and now with the enemy already fleeing, the war chariots will surge forward once again. And because now the enemy infantry was no longer in a dense formation, the chariots will pass by, crushing and launching projectiles at their beaten foe, turning their escape into a massacre. With those two military elements, Sumer reached its peak, but in time, decadence started to settle in, with the rise of inefficient leaders and internal fighting, followed by the final decline and fall of the state. And because the Near East was already a territory with a substantial population beyond the borders of Sumer, others soon found themselves in their own process of natural growth. Even nomadic people could be a substantial threat against any state, and by 2000 BC, the Sumerian civilization disappeared. Well, Sumer was the first state of humanity, and that state can help us to understand the evolution of armed forces of any people of antiquity. And in particular, in this video, I want to emphasize the use of technology and tactical organizations to have an advantage over their enemies. On the first point, the search for a technological advantage has always been relevant, such as having the best metals or the best war chariots. But even cutting-edge equipment can become obsolete. The Sumerian chariots had some technological issues, such as poor speed and poor maneuverability, and their production was very expensive. And because their enemies eventually found ways to neutralize them, for the last 3 centuries of the Sumerian history, their war chariots disappeared from their armies. And it is also of great relevance to point out the evolution of tactical formations. At the beginning of history, there was no organization. Even for several thousand years, Sumer had heavy infantry who fought without any type of organization. But eventually, they learned to have those close order tactical formation, the phalanxes, to have an advantage over their foes. And this brings us to a point of great significance. In the initial stages of all the people that rose up in antiquity to create mighty armed forces, military lessons had to be learned from scratch. Thus, when Sumer fell in 2000 BC, their phalanxes disappeared, only to reappear with the Assyrians in 800 BC, and then with the Greeks in 500 BC. Even the famous Romans went through this evolutionary process. Initially, their heavy infantry fought without any organization. Then, they learned to use phalanxes, and eventually, they created the legions with their flexible maniples and cohorts. And in their final stages, the Romans returned to the phalanxes until the Western Roman Empire collapsed, and with it, the phalanxes disappeared for a time. But then, they returned to Europe in the Middle Ages, first with the Scots, and then with the Swiss. And in the Renaissance, at the beginning of the modern age, it was the Spanish who took the lead and developed dense formations of pikemen to have their famous tercios. Well, I hope you liked this video, and if you would like to help me, I will greatly appreciate if you give me a like to my channel. Also, if you want to help me, I have a Patreon account where you can support this channel. As always, thank you very much. Regards, Víctor Aguilar-Chang.